Well, it's good to be back tonight. Thank y'all for coming. Well, you won't be here tomorrow night, so thank you for let's cramming it in for 2 nights and anticipate the weather. Anticipate the weather. I hope you enjoy your lima beans. Y'all do have lima beans, don't you? Yeah, lima bean, chili bean. You name it. Now, I appreciate getting to come to Island Grove anytime. I was just thinking, I guess it was yesterday, about 50 years ago or so, 52 or 3 years ago, I came here and your preacher was like my father, old brother C.M. Cummings. And after 50 years, you got a preacher that feels like my son. I love old Jason. He talks to me about anything and everything. Well, stuff you can't talk to y'all about. But anyway, we talk about everything together. And I appreciate his willingness to be open and discussing the things that are important to him that are going on in his life. And Jason, it's a pleasure, brother, to be with you. Pleasure to be with you. I see he used to be the chairman of the D-Men program up there southeast. There was a little fellow, what's his name? He meets when our board meets. No, this is, he writes, he's prolific in writing, but they've moved him from the D-Men leadership to another program in the church. And his name escapes me right now, but he talked about these fellows being students of his in school with him and talked about how blessed we were in our communities to have Jason and Steve and I believe he also, Tim Chavis was there with him. Tim was a good ways back with Dr. Rummage, but I don't think Jason Chandler has done anything there. Chris Webb. These boys have made a mark on our seminary. And the seminary's made a mark on them, wouldn't you say? Yeah, it's made a mark on them. Let's see, we'll go to that slide where it talks about the 3 main sections. 3 main sections. Oh, you're right there. You're right there at it. Okay. Yeah, that's what it says. Now, this is where we closed yesterday. We kind of closed out with those verses in Joshua chapter 1, where the Lord is basically saying to Joshua, not so much this outline, but we take from those words in Joshua chapter 1, a kind of a breakout to the way the book of Joshua is organized. And there it is right there. First book's called the Book of War. Book of War. What does that mean? They're trying to take that land that God had promised them. Now, God just doesn't give it to them. There's some effort on their part. But we'll see, and if you read through those chapters, you'll see that God's the one who really fights for them. Now, he fights with them, but God fights for them. And so we cooperate with God. They cooperated with God, but God does the work. And the second part is the boring section. It's the section where they're distributing all this property. And we have a handout there for you, distributing all that property. And I couldn't fit that on a slide, Brother Terry. If I'd have sent it to you, you probably would have been able to. And then finally, the closing section is given to us in the last 3 chapters of that book. Well, there's another little graphic of it in this next little slide. And this is just a little graphic format in the next slide. And there you see it. Actually, up until chapter 6, there's just preparation for the fighting. The fighting doesn't start until chapter 6 with the assault on Jericho. So you got 5 chapters where the folks are busy or Joshua's helping them to prepare. They're still on the other side. They're still on the other side of the Jordan River. And can you go down a couple of slides? I want to show you where these folks are positioned. If you'll go to that map, next was the map. If you look at this map up here, you see that little town Shechem on the right? That's where all of this is taking place, is as far as chapters 1 through 5 are concerned. And actually, this is also where Moses led them to. Now, you know, Moses was able to look across that river and see the promised land. There's a little rise there called Nebo or Pisgah. Pisgah and Nebo are similar kind of low mountain peaks. And Moses is up there on Nebo and gets an opportunity to look over at what God had promised them for hundreds of years ago, maybe 800 or 900 years ago, when they made the promise to Abraham. We referred to that last night in Genesis 12. And this is the land over across that river. Now, it's not all of it. It's just kind of, when you put maps on PowerPoints, and they're long, narrow strips. The Holy Land is a long, narrow strip. I just kept looking to try to find a map that would give you a little context as to how big that little narrow strip is. And you'd look at the little tiny place, what we call the Holy Land is, and think of all that God made out of it and all that the trouble God went to of preparing that for his people. And you'd come away thinking, well, that's just a little old, well, that's nothing. Well, it is something. It is something. Because there are major empires to the north of this little strip. There are major empires to the south of this little strip. There's major empire to the east of this little strip. And when they're doing trade and business with each other, oftentimes they're passing right through that little strip. So maybe God had more of in a strategic kind of way. This is kind of like the crossroads in a way. Well, I'm stretching that, but it's kind of like this Holy Land is sort of like the crossroads. You want to go from Assyria up in the north? Well, man, you want to go from, you know, where the Apostle Paul took all of his missionary trips, or even, you know, up in that region, up in Galatia, up in those places, up in there. And you want to go, say, for instance, you want to go, well, if you're going to go to Egypt, you probably wouldn't go by land. But if you did go by land, you'd come through this area. You'd come pretty closely through that area. If you were over in Babylon, and wanted to go down to Egypt, very likely, you'd go up that little crescent trip that Abraham took, and you come right through this territory here. If you were in Egypt and trying to get up into the north, you'd come up through this. So strategically, God knew exactly what he was doing. You know, if God needs to be made known to all people everywhere, there needs to be some way that all people everywhere can be accessed. And one way they could be accessed in this Holy Land is just by trade routes or traveling through there. And now we've got, we're so sophisticated now, you don't have to leave home to make God known. You sit at home and make God known. I don't know if y'all use a little Bible app, but yesterday morning, Jenny is a Bible teacher. What's her name? Anita, Jenny something. Ladies Bible teacher, and I know you've heard her because she's a tremendous teacher, is having a gathering 25 is what it's called. And of course she ministers, mainly the women's Bible studies. And she's having an international worldwide conference called Gathering 25, where she's trying to reach 2 billion people with her broadcast and just bringing people into a prayer and a worship environment by way of digital technology. I mean, it's what we can do now. But what they could do back then was on Pat and Charlie or by ship. And it turns out that the Promised Land is just a beautiful location. And if you look at, I mentioned that Gaza Strip. That thing's on the Mediterranean. And people pay big money in America to go over there and get to just vacation in that Mediterranean waters. And the Gaza Strip, where they lost 40 or 50,000 people in about 18 months, is right there on that Mediterranean Sea. So God picked out a beautiful place for it. And it said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a land as a homeland. Abraham actually lived in tents. He lived in a tent. He was a nomad. He was a pilgrim. He traveled from place to place. Never built a house. And he actually never built a house. When he finally got into Canaan over in Genesis 12 and 13, you know what? The first thing he did was built God an altar. He built God an altar, and the second thing he did, he pitched a tent for Sarah. That's a good order, isn't it? Build a place for God and then build a place for your wife. Is what Abraham did. He never had a house, but he did have a tent. And so God had said to him, I'm going to give you a place where you'll settle down. And it wasn't necessarily for Abraham, but it was for his offspring. And by the time we're studying here, some of these real conservative teachers of the Scripture believe there could have been between 2 or 3 million of these people. Now, if you don't think that's considerable, think about how long it would have taken them to cross the Red Sea. And how long it would have taken that crowd of people to cross the Jordan River. I mean, it's not just a matter of the leaders getting across there. And you know, their cattle as well. You know, their cattle as well. I hated to even think about that. I don't think I'll bother with that. That'll make you. But anyway, Shittim is where they're situated. There's property on the right side of that little blue line. That's the Jordan River. There's property on this right side that they have already conquested. Is that a right? Conquested. They've already taken some property on the east side of the Jordan. And that's where 2.5 tribes have already got their property. On the left side of that Jordan is where the other 9.5 tribes, that's all that they're going to get on. Well, you've got it on this map. If you look on that map, you'll see on the right side of that Jordan River, you see on there, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. And by the way, they conquered that right side when Moses was with them. Moses, and not Joshua, but Moses was with them on that right side. And Moses just missed getting to cross over that river with them, but because of his disobedience, he wasn't able to do that. So, Shittim, I don't know if you can keep that in your mind, but you do have this as well. Shittim. I need to take this in according to the order that I'm going in. Otherwise, I'll be down at the end of my session and haven't taught you the first of it. All right, let's go to this slide right before that, Brother Terry. And right before that is Joshua. It's actually in chapter 2. Now, at the end of chapter 1, let's just assume we understand, at the end of chapter 1, they are really getting ready to go on over into Canaan. Now, that is to begin the war. But before they do, Joshua does something Moses did. He sends some spies over there. Now, how many spies did Moses send? Y'all remember? He sent 12. And wonder why he came up with 12. It's a good round number. One from each tribe. That's exactly right. One from each tribe. And, of course, Joshua was one of them. But Joshua only sends 2. Joshua only sends 2. And Joshua sends them over to Jericho. Yeah, he sends them over to Jericho. By the way, have you ever heard this? Jericho may be the oldest city in our human ancestry. Jericho may be the oldest city in the world. You ever heard that? Yeah, I saw that. I'd heard that, and I saw it in some of these notes. So it was a pretty ancient city. Secondly, about Jericho. Now, not all of these cities that you see on this little map, not all of these are fortified cities. Jericho was fortified. Hebron was probably fortified. The city up in the north up there called Hazor, fortified. Now, what I mean by fortified, they had walls built around them. Walls built around them, and a lot of the population would live on those walls, around the circumference of that city, inside the walls, but a lot of families would live on that wall. This is a beautiful way for them to have protection from their enemies should enemies come and assault them. But there were so many of these little towns that Joshua had to deal with. They really weren't really fortified places. And they might have been, they might have been like, almost said Union Chapel. Parkton, let me say Parkton. My little community is like Parkton or and when you go to Hoke County, there's one municipal in Hoke County, and that's Rayford. And I couldn't believe that. I said, there's got to be more than one town in Hoke County. But it's basically the one municipal in Hoke County. But you got a lot of little crossroad communities, little hamlets or whatever. The Holy Land had several of those. And so that wasn't too much of an obstacle for Israel to consider. But a city like Jericho, a city like Hazor, or a city like Hebron, or some of these larger places were considerable places that they had to go up against and attack. So the spies went out to scout Jericho. And what they did was they ended up at the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab. Now, I don't think that, I was reading somewhere in somebody's comments about why in the world do they go to a prostitute's house? And I don't think there's anything in here that's immoral or anything like that. But there's a lot of traffic, very likely, in a prostitute's house. Isn't there when you go? Anyway, there's probably a lot of in and out traffic. And the reason I say that, they could have been somewhat inconspicuous by going where there's a lot of traffic in and out. Not many people go ask questions about that. Second thing is, her house is built on the city wall. And you're still laughing about that, ain't you? I caught you on that one, yeah. But anyway, the house is built on the city wall. So if they do have to get away, have to get out of there, it's not a big undertaking to slip out through the back, and you're on the outside of the wall. And so that's probably another reason. But why don't we just allow for the fact that God was in this? That God was up to something with this, because Rahab turns out to be, because she is a woman of faith. And by the way, the reason this turns out to be a good experience is that Rahab has already heard about the good success that Israel has had. Now, that's in chapter 2. I could just read that to you. That's chapter 2. Rahab said, we've heard about how God has given you one victory after another. And I don't know how far back that goes, but what God had been doing for Israel was not a secret in Canaan. The word had crossed over. Well, for heaven's sake, some of the battles they had fought on the east side of the river, they had gone up against some significant kings. They'd gone up against this guy, Sihon, in the lower regions on the east side of the Jordan. They had gone against this guy, Og, on a little bit further north up, and they defeated them rather decisively. And so that word spread. Now, I believe it's up in Og where they think that that's where the defeat of the giants might have come into play. You remember back in Numbers, whenever Moses sent 12 spies, they came back and said, there's giants over there. There's Anakim over there. There are Rephidim over there. And they were for sure right, 9, 10 feet tall men. And one in the Bible, a little bit later on, about Goliath. And many of these Bible teachers think that Goliath probably was related to some of those Anakim or some of that Rephidim crowd. But Joshua and Moses, they had defeated these kinds of fierce enemies. And a word like that spread. And Rahab, when these men came in, and maybe we'll look at chapter 2. It's in chapter 2. Got there. Let's see. Yeah, they got there in chapter 2, and Rahab basically said that she'd heard all of that had had been going on with them. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, sent those spies out. And it was told the king of Jericho that these men had come. So the king of Jericho, in verse 3, sent over to Rahab, saying, bring those men out who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country. Then the woman took the two men and hid them in her upper level part of her house. She hid them there. But so when she did not bring them out, in verse number 6, because she hid them, hid them under the flag. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords, and as soon as they pursued them, had not gone out, they shut the gate. They shut the gate, thought they had escaped from them. But these men were hiding, and whenever the search party had come for these men, Rahab makes up this story, says, they've already left. Yeah, they've already escaped. And if you'll get out there in a hurry, you probably can overtake them. But they were sitting up on a rooftop. And she had now it sounds like she's telling a lie. Well, she is telling a lie. But I guess for this purposes, and this won't work with your mama, though I guess for some purposes, in telling something untruthful like that, that's what she did. And so they were able to miss that search party, missed these two spies. Because after they left out, Rahab comes back to them and basically opens up to them. Basically opens up to them and makes a pretty strong confession about what she believes about the God of Israel. And the God, he must be the God of heaven. He is the God of heaven and earth. And she, if she's the only one, she is a believer in Jericho. She is a believer. And she assists these men with that in mind, knowing what God has already done. And by the way, it ought not be hard for people to believe God, especially people that know that there have been some unusually wonderful things happened in their lives, and they have no explanation for it except to say this had to come from God. But you know what we'll say? We've replaced giving God the credit to saying that was just good luck on my part. Well, I like what the old people say. They say luck's with the Lord. And I believe that's right. The good favors that come on your life, you ought to look to see if God isn't at work somewhere or another in your life, proving himself. That's what happened to Rahab. That's what happens to Rahab. She expresses the faith toward God that these spies have come on an assignment from. So when she's about to let these men go, she makes a request out of them. She knows that Jericho is in the bullseye of Israel. And so she wants a pledge from them that when they do bring an assault on the city of Jericho, they will spare her house. And not only her house, but her family as well. And so the spies are happy to accommodate her. And they told her that when the assault takes place, they gave her instructions on how she could help Israel identify which house was hers. Do you remember what she was supposed to do that would help the Israelites identify which house was hers? What was she supposed to do? She's supposed to drop a scarlet cord. What color is scarlet anyway? Red. A red cord out the window so that her house could be identified whenever they came under assault. Well, as it turns out, that was an important sign for her, but it's also saved her life. But now it's not only saved her life. Do you know who else was saved in that? Do you know who else was saved? Her father was saved. Her siblings were saved. And maybe her mother as well. But her whole family came into the house. The spy said, now you bring them in your house and tell them not to leave. Tell them not to leave your house. If they leave, we're not going to be responsible. Their blood will be on their hands. I think that comes right out of the Bible. If they leave your house, you tell your family your blood will be on your hands. But if you will stay in this house, if you will stay in this house, you will be saved. You will not be put to death. So that's a beautiful little story to tell. But there's so much impact on that you've got to see the hand of God in that. And if Joshua pushes and promotes a theme, he's pushing and promoting this idea that God is so much involved in the Israelites being able to not just get in that land, but to overtake that land. It's like it's being orchestrated by God. You ever thought your life was being orchestrated by God? To see what you've been through and what you've faced and how you've overcome and where you're sitting right now. Can you see any evidence where God looked like has been just writing your story day by day to put you in the place where you are? Well, this is a prime example where God proves himself to be in charge of the affairs that are going on right there. So there's that slide with that the slide with the map on it. Let's go past the map, Brother Terry. Let's go past the map. And we'll get to chapter 3. Now, to get to chapter 3 is the miraculous crossing of the Jordan. They haven't crossed it, but this is where the miraculous crossing of the Jordan happened. And matter of fact, in chapter 2, verse 24, the spies reporting back to Joshua says, "Truly the Lord has delivered all the land into our hands, for indeed all the inhabitants of that country are faint-hearted because of us." Well, it must have been. Not just Rahab, but the leaders of the city were as well. Now, so in chapter 3, Joshua gets up early, and he sets out and comes to the Jordan, and all the children of Israel lodged there before they crossed over. So it was after 3 days that the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests and the Levites bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it." Joshua says, keep space between you and that ark of at least 3,000 feet. Did they say 2,000 cubits? Yeah. A cubit's a foot and a half. 2,000 cubits is 3,000 feet. 3,000 feet is better than a half mile. So you can see it, but you don't get any closer than that. And probably the reason why is there to keep their distance is so people could see the ark up there. I mean, if it's 2 or 3 million people, folks are getting too close to the ark. All of a sudden, you're shielding the people way at the back from being able to see that ark ahead of you. And it's important to see that ark because God wanted specifically that ark to go ahead of the people. Now, what did the ark mean to Israel? What does this ark mean? Well, what is the ark? Well, I looked for some graphics for that as well. It's a chest. It's a chest. And they actually have covered that chest out of acacia. They made that ark out of probably acacia wood in the wilderness. And the reason they probably used acacia wood is because there was plenty of it. And just used acacia wood. And then they overlaid it or kind of plastered it somehow or another with gold. And the lid to that ark in their tabernacle was the mercy seat. On that lid were 2 cherubs that were facing each other, and their wings were reached out and touching one another. This is the holiest article that belongs to Israel. The tabernacle was a holy place. The curtains that they used to form that tabernacle were holy things. The staves and the rings that held all these things were holy things. But nothing was as sacred as this ark. Inside that ark or inside that chest, they put the law of God that Moses had brought down. They put the rod that Aaron had that budded. They put some manna in there as well. Later there's manna in that chest. And so to the Israelites, that ark, when they were in the wilderness and the tabernacle was built, that ark sat in the tabernacle. But it didn't sit in the large chamber. It sat in the smaller chamber called the holiest place. It was just behind the curtain that divided the holiest place from the holy place. Nobody had access to that ark except the high priest. And he only went before that ark one time a year. And he never went behind that curtain to stand before that ark if he didn't have blood on his fingers. And the high priest would wear a robe. I mentioned his robe last night. But on the tail of his robe, there were these little bells that would jingle when he was walking back there. And when you would hear the jingle of the little bells, you know the high priest is still moving and he's still active. But if those bells stop ringing, you know, you need to be concerned. If he's dead back there, you better pray that you're not the one that has to go get him. So some traditions say that he actually had a rope tied around his ankle, so that if he died in front of that Ark of the Covenant, you could drag him out of there without having to go in and then jeopardizing your own life. I'm telling you, we don't take seriously nearly the way Israel had to respect that ark. You remember one time the Philistines got it and they were trying to move it back, trying to bring it back into Israel. And they were hauling it along. And I don't know what happened. It must have hit a mud hole or something or another. And how they were bringing it on the cart. And it was just like it was a little topsy-turvy or something. And one of the men tried to steady it. You remember that story? And he dropped dead right there. Dropped dead right there. Now, you don't thank the Lord for that, but you do say, Lord, there's a lesson in that. What is that lesson? That's how precious and valuable this ark was. I don't know of a thing in this building that we regard like that. I don't know anything in my house I regard like that. And so what Joshua says, and by the way, when they would move that thing, they had staves on each side. You know, kind of like a casket. When you see a casket, there's a little bar that the pallbearers will grab that bar and they'll carry that casket. Well, with the Ark of the Covenant, there were poles, so to speak, along, you know, a pole going this way and one going that way. And the men would grab the pole and move it whenever they had privilege to do that. And that's how the ark was carried. Joshua says to the priest, I want you to get that ark. And I want you to get ahead of these people. And these people are going to be 3,000 feet behind you. That Jordan River is flowing. And by the way, it might have been the spring, but it was the season of the year where the Jordan River swelled up and sometimes may have overflowed because it was the sea, had to do with the season for their crops. And so the Jordan River was at its highest peak. And that's whenever God chose to have them cross that river. And so here's what Joshua said. And God told Joshua to tell those priests to step their foot in that Jordan River. And when they do, stand still right there. And that water will stand up on both sides. And exactly what it did. As soon as the priests put their foot in that water, all of a sudden the Jordan River stops. And it begins to wall up and opens up. Do you have in your mind something that happened similar to that about 40 years earlier? Yeah, that's when Moses crossed over the Red Sea. And God opens up the Red Sea. Now, you got to see God all over this story like I'm emphasizing again. So the priests who were carrying that Ark of the Covenant step into the river. God miraculously parts that water, and the people cross on dry ground. Now, don't worry about, how did it dry that fast. Who knows how it dried that fast? but they went over on dry ground. All right? So Joshua commands, after they cross over, he gets one man out of every tribe to go back down in the middle of that riverbed and bring out a stone. They bring out a stone, 12 stones, and he builds a monument on that inside the Canaan land. He builds a monument there to commemorate. You see that word miraculous? To commemorate what God had done so they could cross over that Jordan River. Now, there's something about Israel and monuments, memorials. It was to be a memorial stone. I've got a slide here that has several of these stones. Will you go to that next slide, Brother Terry? Memorial stones. They cross the Jordan and they build a monument out of memorial stones so that future generations, in coming back and see that pile of stones, there's a little story that goes with that pile of stones. Leonard Sweet said everything in your house, what he's talking about, little whatnots and decorative pieces in your house. He said every decorative piece in your house ought to have a story behind it. Now, you'll understand what I mean. You've got some things in your house that are special to you because there's a story behind it. And if somebody asks you about it, it's not just something for them to look at. It's something you can talk about, have a little story to say. Miss Quay likes to do stuff like that. She's got various pieces, and some of them, maybe some of you have given to her, and she doesn't forget. I don't know how she does this, but she doesn't forget where something comes from. And she'll look at me sometime and just about get mad. You don't remember that? Well, I really don't remember half of it, actually. But Israel knew that commemorating a place where God had done something important and God had done something miraculous, it ought to not be forgotten about. It ought to not be forgotten about. You know, every once in a while I go to Chapel Hill. I go to the Keenan football field. I go to the Keenan football field because on the 23rd of March, 1969, at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I left the bus station in Carborough. I've been on a bus since 10 o'clock that night coming out of Lumberton, trying to get back to school in 1969. It's my sophomore year. And I was coming out of Carborough, walking through the campus. I lived on South Campus. Back then, Airing House, the dorm for the jocks was there. Hinton James was down there. But that was about the extent of it. And I was coming by that football field. There was a pine thicket basically around that football field. You couldn't find a pine tree there now if you had to die, but that was a pine thicket there, coming through there. I'd been wrestling with God on that bus for 4 hours. And God was burdening my heart about my life. What are you going to do with your life? I'd stepped into the theater there in Lumberton, and one of the Billy Graham endorsed movies had been playing in the theater. And I was standing in the lobby, and a lady came up behind me and tapped me on the back, and I turned around and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were a preacher." If I heard that question one time in those next 4 hours, I heard it hundreds of times. As if God had just got me in the place where he wanted me. That I couldn't move one way or another. I was stuck in a seat. And I wrestled with God all the way to Chapel Hill. Over 4.5 hours on that bus. The last stop we made was in Durham. And then we had to come on into Chapel Hill. The bus station was in Carborough. I walked up Franklin Street where I could cut across and go to South Campus to where my dorm was. And coming in the back of Canaan football field, my heart was so burdened. I was so deeply distraught. I fell on that pine straw under one of those pine trees and said to God, "Lord, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. Nothing is working out. But if you're calling me into your kingdom work, I'll do just what you're calling me to do. I go back to Chapel Hill every once in a while just to review that moment and that experience. I don't know if you've got such a place in your experience, but that's what Israel is doing. That's what they were doing here at Jordan. That's what they were doing right there, is emphasizing what a great thing God has done. And whatever God has done that's good for you and great in your life, it ought to be worth telling somebody about. You know, we used to give testimonies and brag about what God has done for us. And we don't do that as much as we used to. The Jordan River, after they got across on the other side, came back into its normal flow. And they were finally in Canaan. Can you go back to that map a minute? That's 2 slides up. Go back to that map a minute, Brother Terry. Here they are. You see it? Here is Shittim. And they crossed that river. And the point they are at when they cross that river is Gilgal. That's where that is. They're at Gilgal. At Gilgal, they circumcise all the men who have not been circumcised. I believe I shared that with you yesterday, that this was a generation of men. This was a generation of men who had not been circumcised in the wilderness. And so when they crossed over the Jordan River, Joshua is doing everything that's necessary to get Israel to understand we are who we've always been. We are God's people. We are getting back to being the people that crossed over that Red Sea, and we are beginning where Moses began. We are making sure that the law of God is going to be our guide. They made a review of the law of God when they crossed over there and recommitted themselves to doing the will of God. But another thing they did in the circumcising those men, was the clear evidence that we know what our identity is. We belong to God. And men of Israel who belonged to God were circumcised. And Joshua circumcised every one of those men who had been born either in the wilderness who had been born in the wilderness and had never been circumcised. Now, somebody like Joshua was probably already 20 years old or so. Joshua very likely was born in Egypt. And so when he's in the wilderness, he's already circumcised. Caleb, already circumcised, born in Egypt. But many of those men had been born in that wilderness, but they had no sign on their body that they belonged to God. And circumcision was the sign that the Israelite wore that he belonged to God. And so there at Gilgal, they not only have a renewal to the Word of God, they have a renewal to their identity, and here's a place where they even have the Passover again. The Passover, it's been 40 years since the Passover was instituted. On the 40th anniversary or 38th anniversary of the Passover, they celebrated again in Gilgal. I mean, everything's together here. 3 million people are being reminded we crossed that river because God helped us. We defeated the enemies over there because God helped us. We survived that wilderness because God helped us. We got out of Egypt because God helped us. And at Gilgal, they renewed themselves as to who they were. We are the Israel of God. We wear the circumcision, we've taken the Passover, and we've recommitted ourselves to the law of God. We are absolutely sure of who our identity is. All that happens at Gilgal. It becomes the very first place here for Israel to gather in the promised land. Now, all this land is populated with Canaanites and whatever else, but here they set up as an identity hour to confirm who they are. Actually, I believe it was the next screen where all those monuments are, Brother Terry. So if you'll get back, it's 3 screens down. I'll show you the various various monuments. Here they are. There's one at Gilgal. There's one where Achan, remember when Achan sinned? Well, you haven't got there yet. But anyway, Achan sinned at Ai after Jericho. Look at that. There is a monument where Achan sinned at Ai. There's a monument when God gave them Ai in victory. A monument where they failed God, a monument where God restored his favor to them. There's a monument in chapter 8 where Israel was to review its duty and to live by God's instruction. There's another monument there. There's a monument whenever the kings who got in league with a guy named Gibeon, and Israel had got victory and they subordinated themselves to Israel. There's a monument there. And then finally, after Joshua had got them in the promised land and everybody's land had been divided, they built another monument. I mean, that's 7 of them, isn't it? 6. 6 of them. I thought there were 7. But they're in the business of building monuments so they will not forget the goodness of God. I mean, what do we have to do? What do we have to do not to forget the goodness of God? And it appears that it's almost like, God, what have you done for me lately? And we are so quick to not remember. Not remember. It's in Joshua chapter 5 where the circumcision and Passover comes. Circumcision and Passover, not chapter 4, but in chapter 5, Israel camps at Gilgal. Joshua circumcises that new generation of men. The manna no longer is provided, and they won't need manna now because they can eat from the land of Canaan. You remember what they said about the rich provisions over there? Whenever Moses sent the spies, remember the report of the spies was it's a land flowing with milk and honey, pomegranates, grapes. Only we don't say pomegranates, we say pomegranates. There were all sorts of beautiful, wonderful provisions in Canaan. And so when they get across the Jordan, there's no more manna. They can just eat off the richness of the promised land that they're in. So they eat from the produce. They transition, look at this, from wilderness sustenance to the abundance of Canaan. And there's something else they're going to do as well. It's not going to be long. They're going to build houses and overtake houses. They've never lived in a house. They've never had a place where they build their fire and they can build it back the same place month after month after month. They've always been a nomadic people, moving from place to place since they left Egypt. But now they're coming to Canaan, and they can settle down and build them a house and have an acreage for a farm or whatever they choose to grow, or pasture land for their flock. That's something they haven't known. And now they're able to expect that. They celebrate Passover, which Passover is to remind them of God delivering them out of Egypt. And there again, it's reinforcing their identity as God's people. And Joshua encounters the commander of the Lord's army. And that's where, you want to see that in chapter 5, where Joshua meets the commander of the Lord's army. It's in verse number 13. They haven't been to fight yet. They haven't been to fight. But they've got a fight coming. They've got a fight coming. The biggest thing they've had to fight so far is themselves and not believing God. And something, actually that's probably the greatest enemy we have is ourselves. It's not somebody else. They had been fighting themselves, pressing themselves to follow God and believe God. Now, they've got to fight another enemy. Because while they're going to possess, the word possess your possessions, the phrase, God said to them, you need to possess your possessions. What that means is it's yours, but you've got to go get it. It's yours. You possess your possessions. But you've got to go get it to make it yours. So, just before the battle starts, in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13, it came to pass when Joshua was near Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for your adversaries?" And he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take the sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." Been a lot of speculation as to who that man was. I suppose the most common explanation is that this is very likely a pre-incarnate appearance of the Son of God. A pre-incarnate appearance. The Lord of armies, that's who God is. We call him the Lord Sabaoth. He is the Lord of armies. This person said he is the captain, the commander of the Lord's armies. So it has led many Bible teachers to speculate, perhaps this is an angel whom God has sent, or it may be even the presence of God himself in the second person of the Trinity, which would be the Son of God. Now that turns out to be a pretty powerful moment for Joshua. I don't know if you've had any deeply disturbing experiences in your life. You know, God doesn't have to disturb us. But sometimes he does give us some kind of disturbing appearance of some way or another. A thought in our mind, a dream that comes. Preacher Wade was a dreamer. And I'd always be fascinated to listen to him talk about the dreams that he had. I don't know whether I believed him, but I love Preacher Wade. Now, I didn't doubt what he said. But sometimes God speaks to us unusually and comes to us unusually. And this is such an experience for Joshua. Joshua needs it. Joshua needs to have a moment with the one who is in charge of God's armies. I mean, he's looking at a region of people who have powerful weapons. I mean, they're going to be outnumbered. There's no way Israel's got enough fighting men, and Israel has hundreds of thousands of fighting men. But if somebody's got more, you need a little more help. And Joshua needed this final encouragement. And he gets it from God himself, from the army of the Lord, his commander. That's who God's Son Jesus is. He is the commander of the Lord's army. And so I mentioned that that's speculation, but I'm given to believing that. That's probably an appearance of the Son of God before he becomes flesh. And there's some of those in the Old Testament. Now, so these 5 chapters we've had so far, these 5 chapters, here's a few themes that have come up in these 5 chapters. Let me review them with you. The leadership absolutely has been changed. Faithfulness on God's part is obvious. God is doing what he said to Abraham. He's making the way for these people to get to the promised land. On Israel's part, and they've reviewed their commitment, and renewed their commitment to the law of God. They've renewed their identity by the circumcision. They have assembled around the Passover meal to reaffirm this is who we are. We are people who've been delivered. That's who we are. It's kind of like when the Lord's table is set up in your church. That's a good time for you to rededicate yourself to who you are. What that table represents is what's making you who you are in the Lord. And I remember how Preacher Coolidge used to instruct y'all. And he used that little expression that it said some people said when they come in and see that table covered, they'd say, well, I don't know if I'll stay today. They're just having the Lord's Supper. One of the greatest insults to God, very likely, is when you see that table covered and you turn your back on it. It's a moment to reaffirm who you are. Israel had done that, their obedience to God. The importance of remembering God's faithfulness. We've seen that. Emphasizing God's presence and guidance as they go forward. And that's been happening ever since they left Egypt. God has been guiding them. You know, when they were in the wilderness, they were guarded and guided. In the daytime, it was a pillar. It was a cloud in the daytime. At night, it was a pillar of fire, a pillar of fire, guarding these people. God was always present with them. As a matter of fact, he even told them to build me a tabernacle. I want to get in that tabernacle, and I want you to know in that tabernacle, I will meet you in that tabernacle, at that holy place, over that Exodus 25. That's where Aaron was to go, and God said to Moses, I'll meet Aaron right there. God's presence was never questioned. Faith, divine intervention, the sacredness of their mission, all of this is what the first 5 chapters of Joshua are for, before they go to war. And I'd say that it'll help us. Before we get out there and think we can do anything to the devil, we'd better know who we are. We'd better know who we're standing with and who is standing with us. Because you cannot take on the devil on your own. And recognize that God is with me. And God will not fail me. That's precisely what these first 5 chapters are for. Is to prepare Israel for the battle. All right? In chapter 6, they're ready to fight. You want to read it? Chapter 6. Jericho was securely shut up. This is New King James. Because of the children of Israel. They already knew what God had done for these people. None went out and none came in. Those doors were shut. And the Lord said to Joshua, I have given Jericho into your hands. Its king and mighty men of valor. Did God say, now go fight? Look what God instructed him to do. This is curious to me. God says to him, verse 3, you shall march around the city. All your men of war, now the women and children obviously not there, but all your men of war, you shall go all around the city once for 6 days. Verse 4. The 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. But on the 7th day you shall march around that city 7 times. And the priests shall blow the trumpets after 7 times. It shall come to pass. This is God writing the story. I told you he was not sitting in time. God sits in eternity. He's already seen those walls falling. And if you and I could see into the future, we could talk like it's already happened too. But God is speaking as if it's already happened. And it shall come to pass when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all of the people will shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him. And you talk about at ease taking a city. The victory was there. So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests, said to them, take up the Ark of the Covenant. Let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the Ark of the Lord. And he said to the people, you proceed, march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the Ark of the Lord. So it was when Joshua had spoken to the people that the 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced, blew the trumpets, and the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord followed them. Then the armed men went before the priest. The rear guard came after the ark, while the priest continued blowing the trumpets. Joshua had commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth till the day I say to you, shout. Then you shall shout. So he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once. Then they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning. The priests took up the ark of the Lord. 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually, blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them. And the rear guard came after the ark, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. 2nd day they marched. It came to pass on the 7th day, they rose early, about the dawning of the day, marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only, they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the 3 priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction. It and all who are in it, except Rahab the harlot, shall live. She and all who are with her in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. Verse 21, they utterly destroyed all that was in that city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. But Joshua had said to the 2 men who had spied out the country, you go into the harlot's house and bring out that woman and all that she has, as you swore to her. Verse 26, Joshua charged them at that time, cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds this city, Jericho. He shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout. Everything looks absolutely perfect, except something went on that Joshua was not aware of. That's chapter 7. Do you see this screen? Chapter 6, they take the city. Chapter 7 is where it's been revealed that this young man, Achan, has not destroyed everything. He has sinned against God, is what Achan has done. He had seen something shiny, and it looked pretty to him. It looked valuable to him, and he brought that back with him and hid it in the ground in his tent where it couldn't be found. So Achan had sinned against God, and Israel didn't know it. Israel didn't know it. And so when they went up against Ai, which is a very small obstacle compared to Jericho, they did not win that victory. They did not win that victory. And so it was determined that Joshua in verse number 14, in the morning you shall be brought according to your tribe, and it shall be that the tribe which the Lord takes shall come according to families, and family by family that the Lord takes shall come, and household by household which the Lord takes shall come. And we're going to find out who it was that has sinned in Jericho and brought that sin with him back to the camp. In verse number 15, then it shall be that he who is taken with the accursed thing, the word accursed means devoted. And when it's devoted, it cannot be used in any other way except for what it's devoted for. God said it's devoted to be destroyed. It is set aside to be destroyed. What Achan saw that was beautiful to his eyes and appealing to him, he could not follow God on that one thing. And it was only one thing. And it's amazing how God reacts to just one sin. And how disappointed God is with one disobedience. And this is a lesson for all Israel, because they've got 800 years ahead of them, where it's one sin right after another. And right here, with man's one sin, the whole nation paid a price for one man's sin. Now, you may not look at your sin like that, but God does. So Joshua rose early in the morning, brought in Israel tribe by tribe, clan by clan. And then he brought his household, a man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah. He was taken. Joshua said to Achan, my son, I beg you, give glory to the Lord God of Israel, verse 19, and make confession to him, and tell now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. We're all suffering because of you. Achan answered Joshua and said, indeed, I have sinned. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them, and there they are, hidden in the earth in the middle of my tent with the silver under it. I'm the man that sinned. And he was put to death. Achan was put to death. A very severe penalty for what appears to be almost a negligible sin. As much as had been destroyed, as much as had been absolutely done away with in Jericho, and Achan brings out something he can carry in his hand. And all of Israel is suffering. And the end of the story is Achan loses his life over that one sin. Now, the story of that ends sadly for Achan. But the next page is when they go back into Ai and they overtake the city of Ai. There is a conquest. The people all over that Canaanite land are hearing of their success. One man by the name of Gibeon gets in league with a bunch of other kings, and they come to try to make a deal with Joshua. They pretend to be people from a faraway place, and they've heard in a faraway place what a great man Joshua is and a great God they serve. And Gibeon is lying to them. And he says, you see, we've come a long way. Our bread is stale. Our wineskins are tattered, as if they've traveled for days and days and days. And all of it is a charade. And Joshua doesn't know the difference, but he makes a league with them. And later on, that kind of trickery. Joshua finds out the truth and makes servants out of them. But the service they provide is in the house of God. They bring water to the priest. They hew out pieces of wood for the articles in the house of God. It appears that these people who tricked Israel are getting one of the greatest favors they could have got. They get to work in the house of God. But it's not over yet. Then these other points I've made here, southern and northern campaign, is actually in the book of Joshua, talks about how they went straight into Jericho. Jericho looks to be about in the middle of the promised land, maybe a little south, but more in the middle. To the south is Jerusalem. To the south are other major cities. To the north are other major cities. There are three major campaigns. One is through the middle, one is in the south, and the last one's in the north. And everywhere they go, God gives them their victory. God gives them the victory. I'll hurry along. So they conquered the promised land. In the next slide, they conquer the promised land. Joshua chapter 6 through 12, the military campaigns led by Joshua. They obeyed God. They paid for their wrongdoing. They sought God's guidance. And they demonstrated when they were at battle, God was doing the fighting for them. That's chapters 6 through 12, where the fighting takes place. And it's full of those lessons. The conquest at Jericho, the deception of the Gibeonites, and campaigns against kings who came in league with one another. And Joshua defeated them all by the help of God. They defeated them all. And what happens after chapter 12, beginning at verse 1 of chapter 13, I want to read this, and I'm just about done. I'm just about done. And I'm glad I've got a brother at my church that lets me know when I ought to be done. Here's chapter 13. They have subdued every city. In chapter 13, they've subdued every city. As a matter of fact, I may have been too quick there. At chapter 12, verse number 1, is kind of a summary. These are the kings of the land whom the children of Israel defeated, and whose land they possessed on the other side of the Jordan toward the rising of the sun. From the river Arnon to Mount Hermon, way up at Mount Hermon, all the way east to the Jordan, King Sihon of the Amorites on the east side, and King Og on the east side. All of those had been subdued. They had subdued everybody in their path. Now, very likely that's what I just said is hyperbole. Probably not every person in Canaan had been defeated. But there was enough victory that God gave to Joshua that they could now possess the land. Now, sometimes there's hyperbole in Scripture. Sometimes in the New Testament, you'll read where it says all of the people in that town came out to see Jesus. That's very likely. It could be very literal, but very likely it's kind of expressing the fact that when you say everybody was there, well, you don't mean every single person was there, but you mean an overwhelming crowd was there. Last night when I got home, Quay said, "Was anybody there?" I said, "Baby, everybody was there." Well, everybody wasn't here, but it was a whale of a group as far as I'm concerned for a January Bible study that's going to last an hour and a half. And that's a hyperbole. That's a hyperbole. And so when we say that the whole land was taken, that may be a hyperbole. But what it means is anything in that land Joshua and Israel need, they've got it. They got it because God's given it to them. Then in chapter 13, I want you to read the great insult. Chapter 13. When Joshua was old, I want to encourage Brother James Collins. When Joshua was old, Brother James, you listening? First time I came here, he was a young man. Good-looking young man. But when Joshua was old, advanced in years, the Lord said to him, you know how people say this right here while I'm fixing to read. I have people looking at me saying that. You are old. Advanced in years. And there remains very much land yet to be possessed. But you need to divide up what you've got. Divide up this land, and these tribes will keep fighting. What you've been seeing on the news almost every night since October 7, 2023, Israel is still fighting. They're still fighting. Even now. 3,500 years. They're still fighting. Thank God for the United States so we can stand with them. When we see the horror of what's been going on among those Palestinians, it's hard to look at. It's hard to look at. But this is a bitter battle. A bitter battle. And we're still at war. But God says to him, there is much land yet to be possessed. Now, if we close with that, and I will close with that, it's also a picture of what's going on in your life as a disciple of Christ. Do you know you've got the victory by being saved? You've got an eternal victory by the blood of Christ over your sin. You have got forever with God. But very likely there are parts of your life and aspects of your being that God is still trying to get control of. Every year at New Year, we make new resolutions. You know what they call the second Friday in January? Quitting Day. Quitting Day. The second Friday in January. You know what they mean by quitting day? All those people that made commitments lasted about 10 or 12 days. We're there, folks, in our Christian life. We're going to heaven, but we may be limping our way in. Limping our way in because there are areas in our life that we have not let God have control of. That's what God said about Israel when he said to Joshua, you're old, man. You're old. But you fought hard. And all of this territory I've given to you, not all of it is possessed. But Joshua got a well done from God. The last chapter in the book, and I need to read that verse. I don't see what that verse is. I think it's, let me read the last verse I want to read, and then Brother Jace will give our benediction. The last verse in Joshua, maybe it's in Joshua 22. I know there's 24 here, but there's one good summary verse. Chapter 24, Joshua puts a challenge to them about remaining who they are as the people of God. I was looking for the verse that I had wrote a note on to make sure. that I read to you because I felt like it closed out this study in a way that was absolutely. Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45. I'll just read these and I'll be done. We're here? Here we go. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers. They took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. Not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. That's an amazing thing to say, but it's what we believe. If you have God's word on it, it will never fail. And that's the lesson of Joshua. God will keep his word. Whether we trust him or not, God will keep his word. Brother Jace, you want to close our time out? Thank y'all for having me over here these 7 or 8 hours.